Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. I'm your host, Eric Worrell. And in today's episode, I'm going to be getting a little bit nerdy and into numbers, talking about comparing keeping a property versus selling and reinvesting it in the markets. So we're going to be doing a deep dive on this and kind of bringing in a couple different minds on this podcast and sharing those details with you. So we're going to get to that right after this.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
As I mentioned, this is episode 268, and what we're going to be talking about here is based on a real-world example. Last week, I was talking about selling my rental property. I still go back and forth on it, right? It's always, one day you're like, yes, I want to do this. The next day, it's like, no, I'm crazy. Why would I do that? Well, I did talk to my buddy who's a realtor, and he goes, the first thing you got to do is talk to your accountant. He'll be able to give you better details. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the numbers and details that the accountant gave me, and then what those numbers may look like if I was to invest it in other places. So the rental property that I have is 11 years old, and when I bought it, it was $114,500. According to the realtor, he said that $250,000 is probably a pretty good benchmark to use for the sale price. He thinks we could probably get about $250,000. So I shared a bunch of details with my realtor, and I will pull those up actually in the email that I sent him because he ended up calling me with kind of information back. But what I told him is, I owe $60,000 on it. It could sell for $250,000, and I bought it for $114,000. So when it sells for $250,000, he said, your capital gains that you'd be getting taxed on is the difference between the $250,000 and the $114,500 that you sold it for. And also, you're going to be subtracting your mortgage costs out of it. And he said you're also going to want to consider your commission. So he said for a safe bet, you can figure $15,000 right off of the $250,000 for commission. And based on my previous years of taxes, so he's looking at our tax information from 2018, he thinks that we would be taxed a total of $36,000. I do not have a great breakdown of how he got that, if that's just the capital gains. So I apologize because I'm not an accountant. But what he came up with is essentially looks like about $51,000. So subtract that out from the $250,000. So that's again for commissions and tax. So that brings us down to $200,000, and then subtract another $60,000 for the mortgage that I still have on the property. It brings us down to $140,000 of profit. Now, not bad, right? So what I'm trying to decide is, does that final number, $140,000, what can I do with that? Versus what if I hold on to the property and look at other options that are available to me? So really easy thing you can do. There's one calculator that I like that's pretty simple. You can just kind of Google it. If you just look MoneyChimp interest calculator, what you can do with that is I plugged in $140,000 and I said, what if I sold my rental and just put all of the proceeds into the stock market, right? Just bought an index fund that buys the entire stock market, which a lot of people are doing these days. Vanguard popularized this. And typically what you do if you're doing this is you go with 7 or 8% returns. That's kind of your safe bet. 7, if it's low, 8's kind of high. But either of those numbers are a pretty safe bet for what the average returns will be if you're looking at a long period. So what I decided to do was look at 20 years to grow. And the reason I chose that is I still got about 20 years left on that mortgage. I did a 30-year mortgage, and honestly, at the top of my mind, I can't remember if I'm technically in year 10 or 11 of the mortgage. I bought it in 2009. It's 2019, but my brain doesn't work that well. That's why I have an accountant. But I put the number that principal, the amount that I would get back from selling after everything's done, all things considered, I'd have $140,000. If it compounded on average at 7% interest rate for 20 years, the future value of that money would be $540,000. All right. So that's in 20 years. We actually have somebody that's working with us part-time, potentially full-time in the future. He's helping us out with organizing things, but also really he's a numbers guy. He's got a couple finance degrees. His name's Nick. I was showing him a spreadsheet I was working through and saying, hey, like, poke holes in this thing. Tell me what you would do with this spreadsheet. And what the purpose of the spreadsheet is I wanted to get a 20-year visual of what the rental property would be worth if I kept it, and also what would it be worth if I were to hire a property manager as well. So what I did is I took the rent amount this year that the property can take in, which is $2,000. I subtracted out mortgage and taxes. And then I considered for vacancy rates, also the Water City user fees, and then a 1% rule for maintenance. So there's a lot of different rules that people do for maintenance. One popular one is just take 1% of the rental property value. So let's say you have a rental property, for easy numbers, it's a $100,000 property. 1% of that is $1,000 that you should just stock away every single year. And, it can go up as the rental property value goes up, just for repairs. Well, in my particular case, if we believe that the property is worth $250,000, the 1% this year that you'd stock away is $2,500. And then what we did is we put in calculations and I should say not calculations, but formulas to account for appreciation. So we said, if this home value annually increases by 3%, that means my 1% rule is going to go up every year. So in 20 years, I'd actually be putting away $4,383 because we're assuming that the price of the property is increased as well. So I got this big, long spreadsheet. And if you want, I'm not going to include it in today's show notes, but if you are interested in it and seeing what it is, you can email me at eric@rentprep and I can share it with you. But we're looking at eventually a number that's net profit before a property manager and net profit after a property manager. So there's a cell that you can put in what the cost of the property manager is. And what I did is I just put 10% in there. They tend to range 8 to 12%. But I put in a 10% property management fee based on rent collected. So if it's monthly rent being collected is $2,000, well, the monthly cost and yearly cost of that, I should say, would be $2,400 a year. But again, that number is going to go up as your rents increase as well. So what I'm looking at then for final numbers is, well, if I sold the house to be worth $140,000, what if I took that money and then I put it into an investment that returns 7%? What does that look like? Well, we said that's $540,000. But what if I actually just instead, because maybe I don't want to manage the property anymore, I hire a property manager? What does that look like? The final number, 20-year cash flow. So after all expenses, property manager, everything, 20-year cash flow came out to $229,000. So far less than the $540,000. But at that point in 20 years, I would own the property outright. No mortgage would be on it. And the property value, now this is where it gets kind of fuzzy, but what I did is I plugged it into a calculation, said if it's worth $250,000 today, and the property, there's an annual increase of the appreciation by 3%, in 20 years it would be worth $450,000. So now what I can do is I can take that property value in 20 years, $450,000, I can add it to the cash flow that I'm getting on this property, which this property does cash flow very well. And the total property value plus cash flow, and this is after property manager expenses, would be $679,000 or $207. Excuse me, I didn't sleep a lot last night. It'd be just over $679,000, a couple extra $100 on top of that. So I'm going to run through these numbers again, but again, Nick, who's working with us, he's got several finance degrees, and he was really getting into the weeds on it as far as like, he was even looking at a discount rate and considering inflation in different ways and that. But the numbers that we were coming up with are pretty drastic if you're assuming a 7% return in index funds in the market, right? And again, if you're not familiar, index funds, that's just where you're buying one fund. It's got really low expenses and you're just maybe buying the entire market, or you're buying the S&P 500, or you're buying the top 2,000 stocks. If we assume an 8% return on that, that number does jump up to 652,000, pretty close to the 600, nearly 80,000 of the property value and cash flow. So it's kind of an interesting little study. You're still not passively investing with rental property, even if you have a property manager. likelihood of that property manager being with you for 20 years, you're probably going to have some of that to deal with. There are risks, obviously, with rental properties where you could have, you could get sued, you could have a fire, all sorts of stuff that could happen with the rental. But then again, the market has risks as well. You could, get that $140,000 payday, that windfall, and invest it, and just happen to invest the lump sum at a horrible time right before the market just takes a major downturn, where that, at least in my market here in Buffalo, I'm not going to say we're recession proof, but our housing market's pretty stable. It doesn't get too high, it doesn't get too low. So I would say there's less volatility overall. Looking at the projections that I'm seeing for 20-year projections on keeping the property. So this is kind of where my head's at this point, because I'm trying to take as much data in as I can and kind of assess the situation. And just to recap, based off of last week, if you caught last week's podcast, I'm selling the farm. I have a 2-unit, but I also have a wife, a 2-year-old, going to be soon 2-year-old, and a baby on the way in November. So congrats to me. And I know ahead of time after having one, and be like, wow, this is a lot of work. So from what I hear, having 2 is more work. Surprise, surprise. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reduce my time commitments, right? I don't want to be going over to the rental property for a leaky faucet and those kind of things. Yes, I've done the DIY thing for over 10 years. It's worked out great, fixing everything myself. But with time, I am valuing my time more than I did 10 years ago, especially more than I did just even 2 years ago before my son was born. So I'm trying to kind of think of my future in that way of like, all right, what is my time worth a year from now compared to today and versus 5 years ago? And it's very drastically different, right? So for the first time, I'm seriously considering a property manager for that reason. And being able to look at all the data, and really, it's based on a lot of variables, right? We put in a 3% annual increase in the property value. Well, the housing market could collapse and suddenly it's actually down and rents are down or whatever. There's a lot of different factors that you can consider here. But being able to take in as much data as you can before you make a decision is always good. And then being able to, one thing I picked up from the author of Principles, Ray Diallo, is he always triangulates his decisions before he makes a major decision. So he'll reach out if he's getting a quote on a roof per se, right? Roof is pretty expensive. Don't get 1 quote, get 3 quotes. If you're buying bananas, don't go to 3 grocery stores, just go to 1. Like, it's not a big decision. But if you get a diagnosis that you're sick, get 3 different doctors to weigh in on that diagnosis, right? This is a major decision, and one of the principles that he lives by is triangulating his decisions. And he actually used that as a reference in the book, that he was given a terminal diagnosis, said he had about like 6 months to live, and then he talked with a different doctor, and the doctor said, you know what, we think we could possibly do this and you could be fine. Another doctor said, this is not a problem at all. you got to do is just get this is essentially like a sunspot, like we just treat it and you're going to be fine. He turned out to be fine. But what he found out from that experience was that even these top of the line doctors, I mean, this guy's one of the richest people on the planet, so he has really, really good doctors, they couldn't agree on his sickness. And he said by triangulating it, he could find the information that worked best for him. And he started with the least abrasive option and started working backwards from that, and that least abrasive option worked best. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now, is I'm looking at the situation and saying, okay, I have this rental property. It's been obviously a tug and pull relationship where, any landlord knows this. You have times where you're like, you haven't heard the phone ring in 9 months and you're just getting paychecks or rent checks on time every month. And being a landlord is the greatest thing ever. And then all of a sudden it's just like, oh, the basement flooded and there was some stuff down there and it's wrecked and you got to go deal with it. Right. So I'm weighing my options on that and trying to figure out, pretty much look at all the data the best I can so I can make an informed decision on what to do. And today, looking at things. I'm like, you know what? I may keep it and hire a property manager. Andrew Schultz has been on the podcast several times. We used to do the weekly video series as well. He'd be my first go-to on that. Yeah, it's just interesting to be able to take all this stuff in. And I guess this is kind of just part of growing up and figuring these things out and living with your decisions on what you end up doing. I could decide to keep this, and also in the housing market collapses in a year and I'm like, oh, I should have sold it, So I just wanted to share with you guys again. If you're interested in the spreadsheet, I can share with you what I got so far. I don't want to make it public on the website because I'm going to be tinkering with this a little bit more with Nick as his time frees up here, and we can kind of start working on some of these resources for you guys. But I just wanted to share with you where I'm at because I'm kind of piggybacking off of last week's episode. So until next week, guys, I'm sure I'll change my opinion 10 times on selling or keeping the property, but still working through it, talking with the professionals, realtor, accountant, Nick, who's really good with spreadsheets and figuring that kind of stuff out too. So until next week, have a great week. Take care.